Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. I've been hauling freight across the continental US for about 12 years now. I've driven through blizzards in Montana, dust storms in Arizona, and fog so thick in Oregon I couldn't see my own hood. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what happened on Interstate 80 through Nebraska. It was late October, around 2 in the morning. I was driving a load of electronics from Sacramento to Chicago, and I'd been on the road for about 9 hours straight. I know the regulations say you're supposed to take breaks, log your hours properly, but when you're trying to make a delivery window and the money's tight, sometimes you push it, sometimes you push it too far. The stretch of I-80 through Nebraska is mind-numbing. It's flat, dark, and endless. The kind of road where you can set your cruise control and barely touch the wheel for miles. There are these long stretches where you don't see another vehicle for 30, maybe 40 minutes. Just you, the hum of your engine, and the occasional green mile marker reflecting in your headlights. I remember rubbing my eyes, feeling that familiar heaviness creeping in. My eyelids were getting harder to keep open. The white lines on the road started blurring together. I turned up the radio, rolled down the window to let the cold October air slap me awake. It helped for maybe 10 minutes. Then I saw the rest area sign, 2 miles ahead. I figured I'd pull in, catch maybe 20 minutes of sleep, just enough to reset. I've done it 100 times before. You park, you lock the doors, you set your phone alarm, and you close your eyes. 20 minutes feels like heaven when you're that tired. I pulled into the rest area. It was small, just a bathroom building and maybe 6 parking spots. There was one other car there, a silver sedan parked near the building, but no one around. The lights above the bathroom flickered weakly, casting this sickly yellow glow across the pavement. The air smelled like diesel and wet grass. I backed my rig into the farthest spot, killed the engine, and locked the doors. I set my phone alarm for 20 minutes, leaned my seat back, and closed my eyes. The last thing I remember before falling asleep was the sound of wind rustling through the trees behind the rest area. When I woke up, something felt wrong immediately. The light was different, not the deep black of 2 a.m., but a pale, grayish pre-dawn light. I sat up fast, my heart already pounding. I grabbed my phone. The alarm hadn't gone off. The screen said 5:47 a.m. I'd been asleep for almost 4 hours. But that wasn't the worst part. I looked out the window, and I wasn't at the rest area anymore. I was parked on the side of a narrow dirt road surrounded by cornfields. The corn was tall, brown, and dead-looking, swaying slightly in the morning breeze. There were no other vehicles around. No buildings, no signs. Just dirt road and corn in every direction. My truck was still running. The engine was idling softly, and the fuel gauge showed I still had over half a tank. But I had no memory of waking up, no memory of driving, no memory of leaving the rest area. I checked my GPS. It was offline. The screen just showed a spinning circle, searching for a signal. My phone had 2 bars, but when I tried to open the map app, it wouldn't load. I tried calling my dispatcher. The call wouldn't go through. I sat there for a long moment, trying to piece it together. Maybe I'd been so tired I drove on autopilot and didn't remember. It happens, right? Highway hypnosis. But this wasn't a highway. This was a dirt road in the middle of nowhere. I put the truck in gear and started driving. The road was narrow, barely wide enough for my rig. Corn pressed in on both sides, tall enough that I couldn't see over it. I drove for maybe 10 minutes, following the road as it twisted and turned, but I didn't see any intersections, any signs, anything that might tell me where I was. Then I saw the house. It was set back from the road, half hidden behind the corn. It was an old farmhouse, white paint peeling off the wood siding, shutters hanging crooked. There was a pickup truck parked in front, rusted and sitting on flat tires. The front door was open. I slowed down as I passed it. I don't know why. Maybe I thought someone there could help me figure out where I was. But as I looked at the house, I saw someone standing in the doorway. It was a man, tall, thin, wearing overalls and a flannel shirt. He wasn't moving. He was just standing there, completely still, staring at my truck as I rolled past. I gave a small wave, just trying to be polite, but he didn't wave back. He didn't move at all. He just stood there, watching. I kept driving. The dirt road finally ended at a paved 2-lane highway. I didn't recognize it, but I turned right and kept going, watching for any sign that might tell me where I was. After about 20 minutes, I passed a green sign that said, Kearney, 38 miles. Kearney, Nebraska. I knew that town. It was on I-80. But I'd been at least 100 miles past Kearney when I pulled into that rest area. There was no way I could have driven backward without knowing it. I pulled into the first gas station I found and went inside. The clerk was a young guy, maybe early 20s, with a name tag that said Kyle. I asked him what town I was near. "You're just outside Elm Creek," he said. Elm Creek. I'd never heard of it. "How far is that from I-80?" I asked. "Maybe 15 miles north," he said. "You lost?" I didn't know how to answer that. I bought a coffee and went back to my truck. I checked the logs on my electronic system, the one that tracks when the truck is moving, when it's idling, when it's off. According to the logs, my truck had been stationary from 2:14 a.m. to 5:52 a.m. It showed no movement, no driving, nothing. But I was 60 miles away from where I'd stopped. I called my dispatcher later that morning after I got back on I-80. I told him I'd had some kind of medical episode, that I'd lost a few hours and needed to get checked out. He wasn't happy, but he let me drop the load in Chicago and take a few days off. I went to a doctor. They ran tests, brain scans, blood work, everything. They found nothing wrong with me. No signs of a seizure, no sleep disorder, no neurological issues. The doctor said maybe it was extreme fatigue, that I'd driven on autopilot and my brain just didn't record the memory. But that didn't explain the logs. It didn't explain how my truck moved 60 miles without the system recording it. I still drive. I still haul freight. But I don't stop at rest areas in Nebraska anymore. I push through even if I'm tired, even if my eyes are burning. Because sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night, covered in sweat, remembering that farmhouse. Remembering that man standing in the doorway and wondering if he's still watching the road, waiting for the next driver to fall asleep. I was hauling a load of refrigerated goods from Los Angeles to Albuquerque, and I'd done the route maybe 50 times before. It's a straight shot, mostly Interstate 40, through the Mojave Desert and into New Mexico. It's long, it's hot, and it's boring, but it's reliable. You know what to expect. This was mid-July, which meant the desert was brutal. Even at night, the temperature barely dropped below 90. I was driving with the windows cracked, the air conditioning blasting, and a bottle of water wedged between my thighs. The road stretched out ahead of me, empty and shimmering in the heat. I was somewhere between Needles and Kingman, Arizona, when I saw the detour sign. It was one of those big orange signs with flashing lights, the kind the highway department puts up when there's construction or an accident. The sign said, I-40 closed ahead, detour, with an arrow pointing to an exit ramp. I frowned. I hadn't heard anything on the CB radio about a closure, and there were no other trucks around me. But the sign was official looking, and I wasn't about to ignore it and get stuck in a road closure. So I took the exit. The detour led me onto a 2-lane state highway, heading north. The road was paved but rough, with cracks running through the asphalt, and patches of sand blown across the surface. The landscape was the same as the interstate. Flat, empty, dotted with scrub brush and the occasional cactus. The sun was starting to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. I figured the detour would loop me back to I-40 in maybe 10 or 20 miles. But after 30 minutes of driving, I hadn't seen any signs indicating where the detour would end. I hadn't seen any other vehicles either. No cars, no trucks, nothing. I checked my GPS. The screen showed I was on State Route 68, heading north, but the route back to I-40 wasn't clear. The GPS kept trying to recalculate, but it kept failing, like it couldn't figure out where I was supposed to go. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the desert turned dark fast. I switched on my high beams and kept driving. The road was starting to make me uneasy. It was too empty, too quiet. I tried the CB radio again, but all I got was static. Then I saw the town. It wasn't much, just a cluster of buildings on either side of the road. Maybe a dozen structures total. There was a gas station, a diner, a small motel, and a few houses. The lights were on in some of the windows, but I didn't see any people. I didn't see any cars parked anywhere either. I slowed down as I rolled through the town. The gas station looked old, with analog pumps and a hand-painted sign that said, "Last Chance Gas." The diner next to it had a neon sign in the window that flickered weakly, spelling out, "Open." I thought about stopping. I needed fuel and I could use something to eat, but something about the place felt off. It was too quiet, too still. I couldn't put my finger on it, but every instinct I had was telling me to keep driving. So I did. I passed through the town and kept going north. The road stretched out ahead of me, dark and empty. I drove for another hour, watching the fuel gauge creep lower and lower. I was starting to worry. If I didn't find another gas station soon, I'd be stranded out here. Then the road just ended. Not at an intersection, not at another highway. It just ended. The pavement stopped, and beyond it was nothing but desert. No signs, no barriers, no indication of where I was supposed to go. I stopped the truck and sat there, staring at the empty desert ahead of me. My heart was pounding. This didn't make sense. A state highway doesn't just end in the middle of nowhere. I grabbed my phone. No signal. I tried the GPS again. It was still trying to recalculate, but it wasn't showing me anything useful. I put the truck in reverse and started backing up. I didn't know what else to do. I figured I'd go back to that town, stop at the gas station, and ask someone what the hell was going on. But when I got back to where the town should have been, it wasn't there. The road was empty. No buildings, no lights, no gas station, no diner. Just empty desert on both sides of the road. I stopped the truck again, my hands shaking. I got out and stood on the road looking around. There was nothing. No sign that there had ever been a town there. No foundations, no debris, nothing. I got back in the truck and kept driving south, back the way I'd come. I don't know how long I drove. It felt like hours. The road seemed longer than it had before, stretching endlessly through the dark desert. Finally, I saw lights ahead. Bright lights, the kind you see on an interstate. I reached an intersection, and there was a sign for I-40. I merged onto the interstate and drove east, not stopping until I reached Flagstaff. I pulled into a truck stop and parked. My hands were still shaking. I checked the time. It was almost midnight. I'd lost nearly 4 hours. I went inside and asked the clerk if there were any detours on I-40 between Needles and Kingman. He looked at me like I was crazy. "No detours," he said. "I-40's been clear all day." I didn't argue. I bought a coffee, went back to my truck, and tried to sleep. But I couldn't. I kept thinking about that town, about the road that ended in the desert, about the way everything had just disappeared. The next morning I checked my GPS logs. According to the system, I'd never left I-40. The entire detour, the state highway, the town, none of it was recorded. As far as the GPS was concerned, I'd driven straight from Needles to Flagstaff without stopping. I still don't know what happened that night. I've driven through that stretch of Arizona a dozen times since then, and I've never seen that detour sign again. I've never seen that town. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm driving through the desert and the road is empty, I think about that place, about the flickering neon sign in the diner window, about the feeling that I was the only living thing for miles, and I wonder if I ever really left. Truck stops are my second home. After 12 years on the road, I've slept in more parking lots than I can count. I know which stops have the cleanest showers, which ones have the best coffee, which ones you avoid after dark. I thought I'd seen every kind of truck stop there was. Then I stopped in Iowa. I was hauling a load of machinery parts from Detroit to Denver, and I was making good time. It was early March, cold and gray, with patches of snow still clinging to the fields along Interstate 80. I'd been driving for about 10 hours, and I needed to stop for fuel and food. I saw the sign for a truck stop at the next exit. Big R Truck Plaza, fuel, food, showers. I'd never heard of it, but that wasn't unusual. Small independent truck stops pop up and disappear all the time. I took the exit. The truck stop was set back from the highway, surrounded by empty fields. It was bigger than I expected, with at least 20 fuel pumps and a large main building. There were maybe a dozen trucks parked in the lot, which seemed about right for a weekday afternoon. I pulled up to one of the diesel pumps and started fueling. The air was cold, biting at my face and hands. I looked around while the fuel pumped. The other trucks in the lot looked normal. Big rigs, tankers, a couple of flatbeds. But something felt off. I couldn't see any drivers. No one was moving around. No one was fueling up. No one was walking to or from the building. I finished fueling and parked in the lot. I needed to use the bathroom and grab something to eat. I walked toward the main building. The front entrance had a glass door with a handwritten sign taped to it. Open 24/7. I went inside. The building was warm, almost too warm, and it smelled like old coffee and fried food. There was a small convenience store on the left, a diner counter on the right, and a hallway in the back that I assumed led to the restrooms and showers. The lights were on, fluorescent and buzzing faintly. But there was no one there. No clerk behind the counter, no customers, no drivers sitting at the diner. Just empty space and the hum of the lights. "Hello?" I called out. My voice echoed slightly. No answer. I walked toward the diner counter. There were plates of food sitting on the counter, still steaming. A cup of coffee sat next to one of the plates, still full. It looked like someone had just been there, like they'd stepped away for a moment and would be right back. I walked behind the counter, looking for anyone who might be in the kitchen. The grill was still on, with a couple of burger patties sizzling on the surface. A pot of coffee was brewing, half full. "Hello," I called again, louder this time. Nothing. I felt a chill run through me despite the warmth of the building. This wasn't right. A truck stop doesn't just empty out like this, especially not with food still cooking and customers' meals still sitting out. I walked down the hallway toward the restrooms. The men's room door was propped open. Stepped inside. The lights were on, the sinks were running, and the air smelled like industrial soap. But there was no one there. I went back to the main area and looked out the front windows at the parking lot. The trucks were still there, parked in neat rows, but I still didn't see any drivers. I thought about leaving, just walking back to my truck and getting the hell out of there. But I needed to use the bathroom and I was hungry. I figured maybe everyone was out in their trucks, sleeping or on their phones. Maybe the staff had stepped out for a smoke break or something. I used the bathroom, then grabbed a pre-made sandwich from the cooler in the convenience store. I left a $10 bill on the counter, figuring someone would come back eventually, and walked out to my truck. I ate the sandwich sitting in my cab, watching the building and the other trucks. I still didn't see any movement. No one came out of the building. No one climbed out of the other trucks. It was like the whole place was frozen. I decided to get some sleep. I set my alarm for 4 hours, locked the doors, and stretched out in the sleeper cab. I remember closing my eyes and thinking about how strange the whole thing was. But I was exhausted, and sleep came fast. When I woke up, it was dark outside. I checked my phone. It was almost 9 p.m. I'd slept longer than I intended, but I felt rested. I sat up and looked out the window. The truck stop was gone. I mean, the building was still there, but it was different. The lights were off. The sign was dark. The parking lot was empty. No trucks, no cars, nothing. And the building itself looked abandoned. The windows were boarded up, and the paint on the walls was faded and peeling. I got out of my truck and walked toward the building. The cold night air bit at my skin. I reached the front entrance and pulled on the door. It was locked. I cupped my hands and looked through the glass. The interior was gutted. No counter, no diner, no shelves. Just empty space and concrete floors. There was graffiti on the walls and trash scattered around. It looked like the place had been abandoned for years. I stepped back, my heart pounding. This didn't make sense. I'd been inside that building just a few hours ago. There had been food cooking, lights on, coffee brewing. I walked around the building looking for any sign that I'd imagined it, but there was nothing. The fuel pumps were still there, but they were old and rusted, with out-of-order signs hanging from them. I got back in my truck and checked my GPS. It showed I was at the same exit I'd taken off Interstate 80, the same location, but according to the GPS, there was no truck stop listed at this location. I started the engine and drove back to the highway. I didn't stop again until I reached Denver. I asked other drivers about that truck stop later, described the location and the exit number. No one had heard of it. I even looked it up online, searched for Big R Truck Plaza in Iowa. Nothing came up. I don't know what I stopped at that day. I don't know if it was real or if I somehow dreamed the whole thing, but I still have the receipt from the fuel I pumped there. It's dated March 14th, and it lists the location as Big R Truck Plaza, Iowa. If you're still listening, you probably enjoy stories like this. A like or a comment helps keep them alive. I've driven past that exit a few times since then. I never stop. But sometimes I slow down and look, and sometimes, just for a second, I think I see lights in the distance, glowing faintly in the dark. I was hauling a load of furniture from North Carolina to Memphis, and the drive was supposed to be straightforward. I-40 west, through the Smoky Mountains, down into Tennessee, and straight into Memphis. I'd done it before, and I'd do it again. It was early November, and the weather forecast said it would be clear. The forecast was wrong. I hit the fog about an hour outside of Knoxville. It came out of nowhere, rolling across the highway like a living thing. One moment the road was clear, and the next I was driving through a wall of gray. Visibility dropped to maybe 20 feet. I slowed down to 40 miles per hour, turned on my hazards, and gripped the wheel tighter. The fog was thick, the kind that seems to swallow light. My headlights barely penetrated it, and I couldn't see the lines on the road. I was navigating mostly by feel, keeping the truck centered as best I could. I'd been driving in the fog for about 30 minutes when I felt the exhaustion hit me. It came on fast, like someone had flipped a switch. My eyelids felt heavy, my head started nodding forward, and I couldn't keep my eyes focused. I knew I needed to stop, but I couldn't see well enough to pull over safely. Then I saw a rest area sign, barely visible through the fog. I took the exit and pulled into the rest area. I couldn't see much. Just vague shapes of trees and the outline of a bathroom building. I parked the truck, locked the doors, and reclined my seat. I told myself I'd just close my eyes for a few minutes, just long enough to shake off the exhaustion. I don't even remember falling asleep. When I woke up, the fog was gone, the sun was shining, and the air was clear. I sat up and looked around, and my stomach dropped. I wasn't at a rest area. I was parked in the middle of a field. Not on the side of a road, not in a parking lot. In the middle of an open field, surrounded by tall grass and wildflowers. There were no buildings, no roads, no signs, just endless field in every direction. My truck was off. The engine was cold. I turned the key, and it started up without any problem, but I had no idea how long it had been sitting there. I checked my phone. The time said 11:32 a.m. The last time I remembered looking at the clock, it had been around 9:10 p.m. I'd lost over 14 hours. I checked my GPS. It wasn't working. The screen just showed a spinning circle, searching for a signal. My phone had no signal either. No bars, no data, nothing. I put the truck in gear and started driving. There was no road, so I just drove through the field, heading in the direction that looked most promising. The grass was tall enough that it scraped against the undercarriage of the truck, and I could hear it rustling as I pushed through. After maybe 10 minutes, I reached a dirt road. It was narrow and rutted, but it was a road. I turned onto it and followed it, hoping it would lead me somewhere recognizable. I drove for what felt like an hour. The road twisted and turned through more fields, past patches of forest, past the occasional abandoned barn. But I didn't see any houses, any signs, any indication of where I was. Then I saw the man. He was standing on the side of the road, just standing there, watching me approach. He was old, maybe in his 70s, wearing a flannel shirt and jeans. He didn't wave, didn't move. He just stood there. I slowed down and rolled down my window as I passed him. "Excuse me," I called out. "Can you tell me where I am?" He didn't answer. He just stared at me, his face expressionless. I stopped the truck and looked back at him in my mirror. He was still standing there, still staring. Something about the way he looked at me made my skin crawl. I kept driving. The dirt road eventually connected to a paved 2-lane highway. I didn't recognize it, but I turned onto it and kept going. After about 20 minutes, I passed a green sign that said, "Crossville, 12 miles. Crossville, Tennessee. I knew that town. It was on I-40, but I was supposed to be way past Crossville by now. I should have been almost to Memphis. I pulled into a gas station in Crossville and went inside. The clerk was a middle-aged woman with gray hair and a kind face. "Excuse me," I said. "What's today's date?" She looked at me like I'd asked a strange question, but she answered, "November 9th. I'd left North Carolina on November 8th. I'd lost a day. I bought a bottle of water and went back to my truck. I checked the electronic logs on my system, the one that tracks when the truck is moving. According to the logs, I'd been stationary from 9:14 p.m. on November 8th until 11:38 a.m. on November 9th. The system showed no movement, no driving, but I'd moved at least 50 miles from where I'd stopped. I called my dispatcher and told him I'd had some kind of episode that I needed to get checked out. He wasn't happy, but he rerouted the load to another driver and told me to go to a hospital. I went to an urgent care clinic in Crossville. They ran tests, blood work, a CT scan, everything they could think of. They didn't find anything wrong with me. The doctor said maybe I'd had a severe reaction to exhaustion, that my brain had shut down and I'd driven on autopilot without forming memories. But that didn't explain the field. It didn't explain how I'd ended up in the middle of nowhere with no memory of how I got there. I still drive. I still haul loads through Tennessee, but I don't drive through fog anymore. If I see it rolling in, I pull over and wait, even if it takes hours for it to clear. Because I can't shake the memory of waking up in that field, surrounded by nothing, with no idea how I got there. And I can't stop thinking about that old man, standing on the side of the road, staring at me with those empty eyes. I was hauling a load of lumber from Seattle to Billings, Montana, and the route took me through some of the most remote parts of the Pacific Northwest. It was late February, and the weather was brutal. Snow, ice, freezing rain. The whole package. I'd been driving for about 14 hours, and I was exhausted. I was somewhere in western Montana on a 2-lane highway that wound through the mountains when I saw the lights. They were off to the side of the road, maybe a quarter-mile back in the trees. I couldn't tell what they were. Maybe a house, maybe a ranger station. But they were the first lights I'd seen in over an hour, and I was desperate for a place to stop and rest. I slowed down and looked for a turnoff. There was a narrow gravel road leading into the trees, barely wide enough for my truck. I hesitated, but the exhaustion was overwhelming. I needed to stop. I needed to sleep. I turned onto the gravel road and drove slowly through the trees. The road was rough, and the branches scraped against the sides of my truck. After a few minutes, I reached a clearing. There was a cabin. It was small, made of dark wood, with a stone chimney and a covered porch. Smoke was rising from the chimney, and there were lights on in the windows. There was a pickup truck parked in front, old and beaten up but functional looking. I parked my truck next to the pickup and got out. The cold air hit me like a slap. It was well below freezing, and the wind was sharp and biting. I walked up to the cabin and knocked on the door. No answer. I knocked again, louder this time. Still no answer. I tried the door handle. It was unlocked. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. "Hello?" I called out. The interior of the cabin was warm and cozy. There was a fire burning in the fireplace, and the air smelled like wood smoke and something cooking, maybe stew or chili. There was a couch, a small kitchen, a table with 2 chairs. Everything looked lived in, like someone had just stepped out for a moment, but there was no one there. I stood in the doorway, unsure of what to do. I called out again, but no one answered. I thought about leaving, but the warmth of the cabin was too inviting, and I was too tired to care about propriety. I figured whoever lived here wouldn't mind if I warmed up for a few minutes. I sat down on the couch and closed my eyes. Just for a minute, I told myself. Just long enough to warm up. I must have fallen asleep because the next thing I knew, I was waking up to the sound of a door slamming. I sat up fast, my heart pounding. The cabin was dark. The fire had burned down to embers, and the lights were off. I could see faint gray light coming through the windows. Dawn, maybe. I stood up and looked around. The cabin was still empty. I walked to the door and opened it. My truck was gone. I stepped outside, my breath fogging in the cold air. The pickup truck was still there, but my truck, my rig, my load, everything was gone. There were no tire, tracks in the snow, no sign that it had been moved. I felt panic rising in my chest. I walked around the clearing, looking for any sign of my truck, but there was nothing. It was like it had vanished. I went back to the cabin and grabbed my phone from my pocket. No signal. I tried turning on the lights in the cabin, but they didn't work. I checked the fireplace. The embers were cold, like the fire had been out for hours. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know where I was. I didn't know where my truck was, and I had no way to contact anyone. I decided to walk back to the highway. I followed the gravel road through the trees, retracing the route I'd driven the night before. But the road seemed longer than I remembered. I walked for what felt like an hour, and I still hadn't reached the highway. Then I saw the cabin again. I was back in the clearing, standing in front of the cabin, but I hadn't turned around. I hadn't taken any turns. I'd walked in a straight line down the gravel road. I tried again. I walked back down the road, keeping my eyes on the path, making sure I didn't take any wrong turns. But after another hour of walking, I was back at the cabin. It was like the road looped back on itself, like I was trapped in some kind of circle. I sat down on the porch steps, trying to think. My hands were shaking, and not just from the cold. I didn't know what was happening. I didn't know how to get out. Then I heard an engine. I stood up and looked toward the gravel road. A truck was coming through the trees, a big rig, just like mine. It pulled into the clearing and parked next to the pickup. I ran toward it, shouting and waving my arms. The driver's door opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall, maybe in his 50s, wearing a heavy coat and a trucker's cap. "Thank God," I said. "I've been stuck here. I don't know where I am." The man looked at me, and his face was blank. No expression, no reaction. He turned away from me and walked toward the cabin. "Hey!" I shouted. "Wait!" He didn't stop. He walked up to the cabin door, opened it, and went inside. I followed him, but when I stepped through the door, the cabin was empty again. The man was gone. The fire was burning, the lights were on, and there was food on the stove, but the man wasn't there. I backed out of the cabin, my heart pounding. I got into the truck he'd been driving and checked the cab. The keys were in the ignition. I didn't think. I just started the engine and drove. I drove down the gravel road, and this time I reached the highway. I didn't stop. I drove for 2 hours straight, not looking back until I reached Billings. When I got there, I called my company. I told them I'd lost my truck, that something had happened and I didn't know how to explain it. They were furious, but they sent someone to look for it. They found my truck 3 days later, parked on the side of the highway in western Montana, right where I'd turned onto that gravel road. The load was intact, the keys were in the ignition, and there was no sign of damage, but the logs showed something strange. According to the electronic system, my truck had been stationary for 3 days. It hadn't moved, but I'd driven it. I'd driven it to that cabin. I don't haul loads through Montana anymore. I reroute, even if it takes longer, because I can't stop thinking about that cabin, about the man who walked inside and disappeared, about the road that looped back on itself, and sometimes, late at night, I wonder if I ever really left. Driving through Texas is an exercise in endurance. The state is massive, and the highways stretch on forever. I've crossed Texas more times than I can count, hauling loads from Houston to El Paso, from Dallas to San Antonio. I know the rest stops, the truck stops, the little towns where you can grab a decent meal. But I'd never stopped at the rest area on Highway 285. I was hauling a load of oil field equipment from Odessa to Carlsbad, New Mexico. It was late August, and the heat was oppressive. Even at night, the temperature hovered around 90 degrees. I'd been driving for about 6 hours, and I needed a break. I saw the sign for a rest area. 5 miles ahead, I didn't recognize it, but I figured it was just one I'd never noticed before. I took the exit. The rest area was small and isolated. There was a single bathroom building, a couple of picnic tables, and maybe 10 parking spots. There were no other vehicles there. No cars, no trucks, nothing. I pulled into one of the spots and got out. The air was hot and still, and the only sound was the faint hum of insects. I walked toward the bathroom building. The lights above the entrance were flickering, casting a weak yellow glow. I pushed open the door and stepped inside. The air was cooler, but it smelled like mildew and old water. The lights inside were dim, and the tiles on the floor were cracked and stained. There were 3 stalls, and all of them were empty. I used the bathroom and washed my hands. As I was drying them, I heard a sound, a faint scratching, like fingernails on metal. I looked around, but I couldn't see where it was coming from. "Hello?" I called out. No answer. The scratching stopped. I left the bathroom and walked back to my truck. The rest area was still empty, still silent. I got into my truck, locked the doors, and decided to rest for a few minutes before getting back on the road. I closed my eyes and leaned back in my seat. I wasn't planning to sleep, just to rest my eyes for a moment. But the heat and the exhaustion pulled me under. When I woke up, everything was different. The sun was up, blazing hot and bright. I checked my phone. It was almost noon. I'd slept for over 6 hours. But that wasn't the strange part. I wasn't at the rest area anymore. I was parked in the middle of the desert. There was no road, no buildings, no rest area. Just endless, flat desert, dotted with scrub brush and rocks. My truck was still running, the engine idling softly. I put the truck in gear and started driving. There was no road, so I just drove in what I hoped was the direction of the highway. The desert was rough, and the truck bounced and jolted over the uneven ground. After maybe 20 minutes, I reached a dirt road. It was barely a road, just 2 ruts in the dirt, but it was better than nothing. I followed it, hoping it would lead me somewhere. I drove for over an hour. The road twisted and turned through the desert, past rocky outcrops and dry creek beds. I didn't see any signs, any buildings, any indication of where I was. Then I saw the fence. It was a tall chain-link fence, maybe 12 feet high, with barbed wire coiled along the top. It stretched across the desert in both directions as far as I could see. There was a gate in the fence, but it was locked with a heavy chain and padlock. I stopped the truck and got out. The gate had a sign on it, but the letters were faded and hard to read. I walked closer and squinted at the sign. Restricted area, no trespassing, U.S. government property. I felt a chill run through me despite the heat. I didn't know where I was, but this looked like some kind of military or government facility. I didn't want to be anywhere near it. I got back in the truck and turned around, heading back the way I'd come. But the dirt road seemed different now. It twisted in directions I didn't remember, and I couldn't find the spot where I'd entered it. I drove for another hour, and then I saw the rest area. It was the same one I'd stopped at the night before. Same bathroom building, same picnic tables, same empty parking lot. But this time, there was another vehicle there. A white van parked near the bathroom building. I pulled up next to the van and got out. The van's windows were tinted and I couldn't see inside. I walked over and knocked on the side. "Hello," I called out. No answer. I tried the door handle. It was locked. I walked around to the front of the van and looked through the windshield. The interior was empty. No seats, no cargo, just a bare metal floor. It looked like a utility van, the kind used by contractors or repair crews. I heard a sound behind me and turned around. A man was standing near the bathroom building. He was tall and thin, wearing a white jumpsuit and sunglasses. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, watching me. "Hey," I said. "Can you tell me where I am?" I got turned around. The man didn't respond. He just stared at me. I felt a sudden urge to leave. I didn't know who this guy was, but something about him made my skin crawl. I walked back to my truck, got in, and started the engine. As I pulled out of the rest area, I looked in my rearview mirror. The man was still standing there, motionless, watching me drive away. I got back on Highway 285 and drove straight to Carlsbad without stopping. When I got there, I checked my GPS logs. According to the system, I'd never left the highway. It showed no detour, no rest area, no time spent in the desert. I asked other drivers about that rest area later, described the location and the mile marker. No one had heard of it. I even tried to find it on a map, but there was no rest area listed at that location. I don't know where I was that night. I don't know what that fence was or who that man in the jumpsuit was. But I know I'm never stopping at an unmarked rest area in Texas again, because sometimes when I'm driving through the desert and I see a rest area sign, I slow down and look, and I wonder if I'll see that white van again parked in the empty lot. I was hauling a load of electronics from Salt Lake City to Cheyenne, Wyoming, and I should have known better than to drive through Wyoming in January. The weather in that state is unpredictable at best and deadly at worst. But I had a delivery deadline, and I figured I could beat the storm. I was wrong. The blizzard hit about 30 miles outside of Rawlins. It came fast, the way they always do in Wyoming. One moment the sky was clear, and the next I was driving through a wall of white. The wind was howling, shaking my truck, and the snow was so thick I couldn't see 10 feet in front of me. I slowed down to a crawl, turned on my hazards, and tried to keep the truck on the road, but the visibility was zero, and I couldn't see the lines. I was navigating by instinct, praying I wouldn't drift off into a ditch. I saw the glow of lights ahead. Faint, but there. I thought maybe it was another truck, someone I could follow. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't a truck. It was a building. It looked like a small motel set back from the highway. The lights were on in a couple of the windows, and there was a neon sign near the road that said vacancy. I didn't see any other vehicles, but I figured the parking lot was just hidden by the snow. I pulled off the highway and into the motel parking lot. The wind was so strong it rocked my truck as I parked. I grabbed my coat and my phone and climbed out. The cold hit me like a hammer. It was well below zero, and the wind cut through my coat like it wasn't even there. I ran toward the motel office and pushed through the door. The interior was warm, almost stifling after the cold outside. There was a small front desk, a couple of chairs, and a hallway that led to the rooms. The lights were on, but I didn't see anyone. "Hello?" I called out. No answer. I walked up to the front desk and rang the bell. The sound echoed faintly in the empty office. "Hello?" I called again. Still no answer. I looked behind the desk. There was a key rack on the wall with about a dozen keys hanging from hooks. Each key had a room number attached to it. I hesitated, then grabbed one of the keys. Room 7. I figured I'd wait out the storm in the room and settle up with whoever ran the place in the morning. I walked down the hallway and found room 7. The door was unlocked. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was small but clean. There was a bed, a nightstand, a small TV, and a bathroom. The heater was running and the air was warm. I dropped my coat on the bed and sat down, exhausted. I tried my phone. No signal. I tried the TV, but it didn't work. Just static on every channel. I lay down on the bed, figuring I'd rest for a few hours and then check on my truck. I fell asleep almost immediately. When I woke up, something felt wrong. The room was freezing, the heater wasn't running, and I could see my breath in the air. I sat up and looked around. The lights were off and faint gray light was coming through the window. I got up and tried the light switch. Nothing. The power was out. I walked to the window and looked outside. My stomach dropped. The motel was buried in snow. The parking lot was gone, covered in drifts that were at least 6 feet high. My truck was barely visible, just a vague shape under a mountain of snow. I grabbed my coat and opened the door to the hallway. The hallway was dark and freezing, and the walls were covered in frost. I could hear the wind howling outside, rattling the windows. I walked down the hallway to the office. The front desk was covered in snow that had blown in through a broken window. The chairs were overturned, and the key rack on the wall was empty. I pushed through the front door and stepped outside. The cold was unbearable. The snow was waist deep, and the wind was so strong I could barely stand. I waded through the snow to my truck. The door was frozen shut, but I managed to pry it open. I climbed inside and tried to start the engine. It turned over a few times, then caught. I let it run for a few minutes, warming up the cab. I checked the GPS. It wasn't working. I checked my phone. Still no signal. I sat there, trying to think. I didn't know where I was. The motel didn't look like the one I'd stopped at. It looked abandoned, like it had been empty for years, but I'd been inside less than 8 hours ago. It had been warm, clean, functional. I put the truck in gear and started driving. The snow was deep and the truck struggled, but I managed to push through. I followed what I thought was the highway, heading east toward Cheyenne. I drove for hours. The storm had passed, and the sky was clear, but the landscape was white and featureless. I didn't see any other vehicles, any buildings, any signs. Finally, I saw a road crew, a couple of plows clearing the highway. I pulled over and flagged them down. One of the workers came over to my window. "Where am I?" I asked. He looked at me like I was crazy. "You're on I-80, about 20 miles west of Laramie." Laramie. I should have been way past Laramie by now. I should have been almost to Cheyenne. "Was there a motel back there?" I asked, pointing west. "Maybe 10, 15 miles back." He shook his head. "No motel out here. Nothing but highway and snow." I thanked him and drove on to Cheyenne. When I got there, I checked my electronic logs. According to the system, I'd been stationary for over 12 hours. But I'd lost almost 60 miles. I went to a hospital and got checked out. The doctor said I was fine. No signs of frostbite or hypothermia. He asked if I'd been drinking or using any medication. I said no. I still don't know what happened that night. I don't know where that motel was or how I ended up so far off course. But I know I'm never driving through Wyoming in the winter again. Because sometimes, when I'm lying in bed at night, I can still feel the cold of that room. And I wonder if I ever really left. Driving through Nevada at night is surreal. The desert stretches out forever, dark and empty, and the highways are long and straight. You can drive for an hour without seeing another vehicle. It's just you, the road, and the stars. I was hauling a load of construction materials from Las Vegas to Reno, and the drive was supposed to take about 7 hours. It was late June, and the heat during the day had been brutal, but the night was cool and clear. I was about 2 hours outside of Vegas, on Highway 95, when I saw the lights. They were off to the side of the road, maybe a mile out in the desert. They were bright, almost blinding, and they seemed to be moving, not in a straight line, but in a strange, erratic pattern. I slowed down and watched them. I've seen a lot of strange things on the road, but I'd never seen anything like this. The lights moved up and down, side to side, almost like they were dancing. I thought maybe it was some kind of military exercise. Nevada has a lot of military installations, and I'd heard stories about weird stuff happening in the desert. I kept driving, but I kept watching the lights in my mirror. Then they disappeared. 1 second they were there, and the next they were gone. I looked around, scanning the desert, but I couldn't see them anywhere. I shook it off and kept driving. But a few minutes later, I felt a wave of exhaustion hit me. It came on suddenly, like someone had drugged me. My eyelids felt impossibly heavy, and I could barely keep my head up. I tried rolling down the window, turning up the radio, anything to stay awake. But it didn't help. I knew I needed to stop, but there was nowhere to pull over. The highway stretched ahead of me, straight and empty. I saw a dirt road branching off the highway. I didn't think. I just turned onto it and drove a few hundred feet before stopping. I put the truck in park, locked the doors, and closed my eyes. I was asleep in seconds. When I woke up, the sun was rising. I sat up and looked around, and my heart started pounding. I wasn't on the dirt road anymore. I was parked in the middle of a dry lake bed, a flat, white expanse that stretched out in every direction. There were no roads, no tire tracks, no indication of how I'd gotten there. My truck was off. The engine was cold. I turned the key, and it started without any problem, but I had no idea how long I'd been sitting there. I checked my phone. It was 6:47 a.m. The last time I'd looked at the clock, it had been around 11 p.m. I'd lost almost 8 hours. I checked the GPS. It wasn't working. The screen showed a message, "No satellite signal." I put the truck in gear and started driving. The lake bed was hard and flat, and the truck moved easily across it. I didn't know which direction to go, so I just picked one and drove. After maybe 30 minutes, I reached the edge of the lake bed. There was a dirt road, faint but visible, leading away from it. I followed the road, hoping it would take me back to the highway. The road twisted through the desert, past rocky hills and patches of scrub brush. I drove for over an hour, and I didn't see any signs, any buildings, any indication of where I was. Then I saw the structure. It was massive, a huge metal tower, maybe 200 feet tall, standing in the middle of the desert. It had a framework of girders and beams, and there were cables running from the top of it down to the ground. It looked like some kind of radio tower or antenna. I slowed down as I passed it. There were no signs, no fences, no indication of what it was or who owned it. It just stood there, silent and imposing. I kept driving, and a few minutes later, I saw another one, then another. The desert was dotted with these towers, spaced maybe a mile apart. I counted at least a dozen of them. I felt a chill run through me. I didn't know what these towers were, but something about them made me uneasy. They felt wrong, out of place. Finally, I reached the highway. I recognized it. Highway 95 heading north toward Reno. I merged onto it and drove for another hour before stopping at a gas station. I went inside and asked the clerk if he knew what those towers were, the ones out in the desert. He looked at me like I was crazy. "What towers?" "The metal ones," I said. "The big radio towers. There's a bunch of them, maybe 20 miles south of here." He shook his head. "I've never seen any towers out there, and I've lived here my whole life." I didn't argue. I bought a coffee and went back to my truck. I checked my electronic logs when I got to Reno. According to the system, I'd been stationary from 11:03 p.m. until 6:52 a.m. The system showed no movement, no driving, but I'd moved at least 80 miles from where I'd stopped. I asked other drivers about those towers later. No one had heard of them. I even tried searching online, looking for any information about large metal structures in the Nevada desert. I found plenty of conspiracy theories, but nothing concrete. I still drive through Nevada. I still haul loads between Vegas and Reno, but I don't drive at night anymore. I stop before sunset and wait until morning, even if it means losing time, because I can't stop thinking about those towers, standing silent in the desert, and I can't stop wondering what they were for and why no one else seems to know they exist. I was hauling a load of seafood from New Orleans to Baton Rouge, and the route was supposed to be simple. Interstate 10, straight shot, maybe an hour and a half. I'd done it a dozen times before, but this time I missed my exit. I don't know how it happened. 1 second I was on the interstate, and the next I was on a narrow 2-lane road, heading into the bayou. I realized my mistake almost immediately and tried to turn around, but the road was too narrow. I figured I'd just follow it until I found a place to turn around. I drove for maybe 10 minutes, following the road as it twisted and turned through the swamp. The trees pressed in on both sides, their branches draped with Spanish moss. The air was thick and humid, even though it was late evening. Then the road ended. Not at an intersection, not at a dead end. It just ended. The pavement stopped, and beyond it was water. Dark, still water stretching out into the swamp. I stopped the truck and got out. The air smelled like mud and rotting vegetation. I looked around, trying to figure out where I was, but there were no signs, no landmarks, nothing. I got back in the truck and tried to back up, but the road was too narrow and the trees were too close. I couldn't turn around without risking getting stuck. I decided to walk back the way I'd come and see if I could find a wider spot to turn around. I grabbed my flashlight and started walking. The road was dark and silent. I could hear the sounds of the swamp. Frogs croaking, insects buzzing, the occasional splash of something moving in the water. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, but it didn't illuminate much. I walked for maybe 20 minutes, and then I saw the house. It was set back from the road, barely visible through the trees. It was an old shotgun-style house, the kind you see all over Louisiana. The paint was peeling and the porch sagged, but there were lights on inside. I walked up to the house and knocked on the door. I heard movement inside, and then the door opened. An old woman stood in the doorway. She was tiny, maybe 4.5 feet tall, with gray hair pulled back in a bun. She looked at me with sharp, dark eyes. "Can I help you?" she asked. Her voice was raspy, like she'd been smoking for 50 years. "I'm lost," I said. "I took a wrong turn, and now my truck is stuck on a road that ends in the water. Can you tell me where I am?" She stared at me for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she stepped back and gestured for me to come inside. I hesitated, but I didn't have many options. I stepped into the house. The interior was small and cluttered. There were shelves crammed with jars of strange things, herbs, dried plants, things floating in murky liquid. The air smelled like incense and something else, something acrid and unpleasant. "Sit," the woman said, pointing to a chair at a small table. I sat down. She moved to a counter and poured something into a cup, tea maybe, and handed it to me. "Drink," she said. "I'm okay," I said. "I just need directions." "Drink," she repeated, more firmly this time. I didn't want to be rude, so I took a sip. It tasted bitter, like dirt and herbs. The woman sat down across from me. She didn't say anything. She just stared at me with those sharp, dark eyes. "Do you know how to get back to the interstate?" I asked. "You shouldn't be here," she said. "I know," I said. "That's why I'm trying to leave." "No," she said. "You shouldn't be here. This place, it doesn't like strangers." I felt a chill run through me. "What do you mean?" She didn't answer. She just kept staring at me. I stood up. "I need to go." "Finish the tea," she said. I looked at the cup. I'd only taken one sip. I didn't want to drink any more of it, but something in her voice made me feel like I didn't have a choice. I drank the rest of it, the bitter taste coating my tongue. "Now go," she said, "and don't stop until you're back on the highway." I left the house and walked back to my truck. The air felt heavier now, oppressive. The sounds of the swamp seemed louder, more aggressive. I got in my truck and started the engine. I backed up slowly, inch by inch, until I found a spot wide enough to turn around. It took me almost an hour, but I finally got the truck pointed back the way I'd come. I drove back through the swamp, following the narrow road. But it seemed different now. The trees looked darker, more twisted. The water seemed closer, creeping up to the edge of the road. Finally, I saw the interstate. I merged onto it and drove straight to Baton Rouge without stopping. When I got there, I checked my GPS logs. According to the system, I'd never left the interstate. The entire detour, the road through the swamp, the house, none of it was recorded. I asked other drivers about that area later. Described the road and the house. No one had heard of it. I still haul loads through Louisiana, but I don't drive through the bayou anymore. I stick to the interstate even if it takes longer, because sometimes, late at night, I can still taste that bitter tea, and I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't drunk it. I was hauling a load of machinery from Pittsburgh to Harrisburg, and the route took me through the mountains of central Pennsylvania. It was early March, cold and gray, with patches of snow still clinging to the hillsides. I was on the Pennsylvania Turnpike, heading east, when I entered a tunnel. I've driven through that tunnel dozens of times before. It's long, maybe a mile or so, but nothing unusual. You go in, you drive through the dark for a few minutes, and you come out the other side. But this time was different. I entered the tunnel, and everything seemed normal at first. The lights overhead cast a dim yellow glow, and I could see the taillights of a car ahead of me. I kept my speed steady, following the car through the tunnel, but the tunnel didn't end. I drove for 5 minutes, then 10, then 15. The tunnel just kept going. The lights overhead flickered as I passed under them, and the walls seemed to close in, narrower and narrower. The car ahead of me was gone. I didn't see it leave. It just wasn't there anymore. I was alone in the tunnel. I checked my odometer. I'd driven over 5 miles, and I was still in the tunnel. That wasn't right. The tunnel shouldn't be more than a mile long. I felt panic rising in my chest. I considered turning around, but the tunnel was too narrow. I had no choice but to keep driving forward. The lights overhead started flickering more frequently, and some of them went out completely. The tunnel was getting darker. I turned on my high beams, but they barely penetrated the gloom. Then I saw something ahead of me. It was a figure, standing in the middle of the lane. I slammed on the brakes and my truck screeched to a stop maybe 20 feet away from it. The figure didn't move. It was a man, I think, wearing dark clothes. He was just standing there, facing me, not moving. I honked my horn. The sound echoed loudly in the tunnel, but the figure didn't react. I honked again. Still nothing. I sat there for a long moment, my heart pounding. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't drive around him. The tunnel was too narrow. I couldn't back up. I'd driven miles, and I didn't know what was behind me. I decided to get out and confront him. Maybe he was having car trouble. Maybe he needed help. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door. The air in the tunnel was cold and stale, and it smelled like exhaust and something else. Something rotten. I walked toward the figure, my flashlight beam aimed at him. "Hey," I called out. "Are you okay?" The figure didn't respond. As I got closer, I realized something was wrong. The figure wasn't standing, it was hanging. There was a rope around its neck, tied to something above, and its feet were dangling a few inches off the ground. I stopped, my stomach churning. I aimed my flashlight up, trying to see what the rope was tied to, but I couldn't see anything. The ceiling of the tunnel was too high, lost in shadow. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding. I got back in my truck, locked the doors, and sat there, trying to think. I couldn't stay here. I had to keep moving. I put the truck in gear and drove forward slowly. I steered around the hanging figure, giving it as wide a berth as I could. As I passed it, I looked at it in my mirror. It was gone. I slammed on the brakes and looked again. The tunnel behind me was empty. There was no figure, no rope, nothing. I kept driving. I didn't know what else to do. After another 10 minutes, I saw light ahead, the end of the tunnel. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I sped up, eager to get out of there. I burst out of the tunnel and into daylight. The sky was clear, the sun was shining, and the road ahead of me was normal. I pulled over onto the shoulder and sat there, shaking. I checked my odometer. I'd driven over 15 miles through that tunnel. I got out of the truck and looked back at the tunnel entrance. It looked normal, just a regular tunnel, with a sign that said Allegheny Tunnel, 1.2 miles. I called my dispatcher and told him I needed to stop for a while, that I wasn't feeling well. He told me to take my time. I drove to the next rest area and parked. I tried to sleep, but I couldn't. I kept seeing that figure, hanging in the tunnel, and then disappearing. I checked my GPS logs later. According to the system, I'd driven through the tunnel in less than 2 minutes. The system showed no delays, no stops, no 15-mile detour. I asked other drivers about the Allegheny Tunnel later. No one had experienced anything like what I'd described. They all said it was just a normal tunnel, nothing unusual. I still drive through Pennsylvania. I still haul loads on the turnpike, but I don't drive through the Allegheny Tunnel anymore. I take alternate routes, even if they're longer, because I can't stop thinking about that figure, about the way it hung there, motionless, and then vanished. And I wonder if I ever really left that tunnel, or if part of me is still there, driving through the dark. I was hauling a load of furniture from Phoenix to Albuquerque, and the drive was supposed to be straightforward. Interstate 40 east, through the desert, maybe 6 or 7 hours. I'd done it countless times before. It was early September, and the weather was clear. I left Phoenix around 4 in the morning, hoping to reach Albuquerque by midday. The highway was empty, just me and the occasional truck heading in the opposite direction. I was about 2 hours outside of Phoenix when I felt the exhaustion hit me. I'd only slept a few hours the night before, and the steady hum of the engine was lulling me into a daze. I knew I needed to stop, but I wanted to make it to the next truck stop before resting. I saw a rest area sign, 3 miles ahead. I figured I'd pull in, grab a quick 20-minute nap, and then push on. I took the exit and pulled into the rest area. It was small, just a bathroom building and a couple of picnic tables. There was one other vehicle there, a beat-up sedan with Arizona plates. I parked my truck, locked the doors, and reclined my seat. I set my phone alarm for 20 minutes and closed my eyes. The last thing I remember was the sound of a crow cawing somewhere nearby. When I woke up, I knew immediately that something was wrong. The light was different. It wasn't the soft pre-dawn light I'd fallen asleep in. It was harsh, bright, midday sun. I sat up and grabbed my phone. The alarm hadn't gone off. The time said 2:34 p.m. I'd been asleep for over 10 hours. I looked out the window and my breath caught in my throat. I wasn't at the rest area anymore. I was parked in the middle of a vast, empty plain. The ground was hard-packed dirt, dotted with sparse tufts of dry grass. There were no buildings, no roads, no signs, just flat, empty land stretching out in every direction. My truck was still running. The engine was idling, and the fuel gauge showed I had just under half a tank. But I had no memory of waking up, no memory of driving here. I checked my GPS. It was offline, just like it had been in Nebraska, and Nevada, and all the other places. My phone had 1 bar of signal, but when I tried to open the map app, it wouldn't load. I put the truck in gear and started driving. There was no road, so I just drove in what I hoped was the direction of the highway. The ground was rough, and the truck bounced and jolted over the uneven surface. After maybe 30 minutes, I saw something on the horizon. It looked like a structure of some kind, but I couldn't make out what it was. I drove toward it. As I got closer, I realized it was a bus, an old school bus, painted yellow, sitting in the middle of the plain. The paint was faded and peeling, and the tires were flat. The windows were broken, and the door was hanging open. I stopped my truck and got out. The air was hot and still, and the only sound was the faint whistle of wind across the plain. I walked up to the bus and looked inside. The seats were torn and covered in dust. There were papers scattered across the floor, old worksheets, faded and yellowed. I picked one up and looked at it. It was a math worksheet, the kind you'd give to elementary school kids. The date at the top said October 12th, 1987. I dropped the paper and backed away from the bus. Something about it felt wrong, like I was intruding on something I wasn't supposed to see. I got back in my truck and kept driving. I drove for over an hour, following the sun, hoping it would lead me back to the highway. Then I saw the rocks. They were massive, towering formations of red and orange stone, jutting up from the plain like ancient sentinels. They looked like something out of Monument Valley, but I knew I wasn't anywhere near there. I drove between the rocks, following a narrow path that wound through them. The rocks cast long shadows, and the air felt cooler in their shade. Then I saw the drawings. They were carved into the rocks, petroglyphs, ancient symbols and figures. I'd seen petroglyphs before, in Utah and Arizona, but these were different. They were more detailed, more intricate, and some of them looked recent. The lines were too sharp, the carvings too clean. One of the drawings caught my eye. It was a figure, a man standing next to a vehicle. The vehicle looked like a truck. My truck. I felt a chill run through me. I backed away from the rocks and got in my truck. I didn't care about finding the highway anymore. I just wanted to get out of there. I drove as fast as I could, pushing the truck over the rough ground. The rocks disappeared behind me, and the plain stretched out ahead, endless and empty. Then I saw the road. It was a paved 2-lane highway, cutting through the plain. I didn't recognize it, but I didn't care. I merged onto it and drove east, following the sun. After about an hour, I passed a green sign that said, Grants, 22 miles. Grants, New Mexico. I knew that town. It was on Interstate 40, but I was supposed to be way past Grants by now. I pulled into Grants and stopped at a gas station. I went inside and asked the clerk what day it was. September 8th, he said. I'd left Phoenix on September 8th. I hadn't lost any time, but I'd lost over 100 miles. I called my dispatcher and told him I'd had some kind of episode, that I needed to drop the load and take a few days off. He wasn't happy, but he agreed. I went to a hospital in Albuquerque. They ran tests, blood work, brain scans, everything. They found nothing wrong with me. I still drive, I still haul loads across the Southwest, but I don't stop at rest areas in New Mexico anymore. I push through even if I'm exhausted. Because I can't stop thinking about that bus sitting alone in the middle of the plain, about those petroglyphs carved into the rocks, showing a truck that looked just like mine. And I wonder if I'm the first driver to end up there, or if others have come before me and never found their way back. Some say these stories ended that night in parking lots and rest stops across America. But if you're a trucker reading this, you know the truth. The road has secrets, and sometimes, when you close your eyes behind the wheel, you wake up somewhere you were never meant to be. Thanks for listening. If you made it through the darkness, you're tougher than most. Stay safe out there on the highway.